On July 28, 1996, at approximately 5 in the morning, John Coppock, an English fisherman, and another fisherman left Brixham Harbour in Devon, southwest England, to go fishing in the English Channel. After a somewhat fruitless morning, they made the decision to venture to the Roughs, an area not many people fish, but they nevertheless went there. Their net, which was weighted, was lowered into the water. Consequently, it descended to the seafloor's bottom, and after an hour or so, they literally hauled up a deceased man's body when they drew up the net. They therefore dialed the cops right away. To examine the body, the cops descended. Additionally, no one had been reported missing at initially, giving the impression that this was just a tragic accident involving a man who had fallen off a boat in the channel. He was still wearing his shirt, and his physique was in surprisingly decent shape considering how long he had been submerged in the water. His shoes were still on, he was wearing a long-sleeve shirt over pants, and he was sporting a Rolex Oyster watch that showed the time and date. However, the date had come to an end on the 22nd, as it had evidently stopped during his time at the ocean's bottom. In addition, he didn't have an ID on him, and his pockets were truly empty. It appeared that someone had opened his pockets before to the arrival of the cops. When his body was removed for a post-mortem examination, several injuries were discovered on him. He sustained multiple injuries on his leg in addition to a big gash on the back of his skull. However, they came to the conclusion that he could have easily sustained these injuries had he fallen off a boat into the channel or been like a trawler pulling up on the bird. Thus, they continue to think that this was an unintentional fatality. Even though his death was an accident, they still needed to identify him, notify his friends and relatives, and take other necessary steps to wrap up the case. However, as previously said, he lacked any form of identity. The only thing that set him out was a tattoo on the back of his hand, which was so smudged that it was difficult to identify what it was. However, as previously mentioned, he was discovered with a Rolex watch on his wrist. When the police contacted Rolex, they were informed that, in the event that the watch was authentic, it ought to carry a serial number that would enable them to identify its owner. Fortunately, they were able to identify the man as Ronald Joseph Platt and confirm that it was a real Rolex. Thus, they might not have been able to identify him if he hadn't been wearing that Rolex. They located Ronald's last known address, which was a rental property in Essex's Chelmsford. They got in touch with the landlord, who provided them with the contact information of a man named D. Davis, who served as Ronald's personal reference on his rental application. The authorities then get in touch with Mr. D. Davis, identifying him as David Davis and informing him that his friend Ronald had passed away. Furthermore, David didn't seem overly shocked or surprised, and to be honest, he didn't really ask too many questions about it. However, he consented to a face-to-face meeting with the police so they could question him and learn more about Ronald's past. When Davis was consulted, his accent gave the impression that he was either Canadian or American. He informed them that he had given Ronald some money so that he could relocate to France and open a business there. And he had traveled to France as far as he knew. In addition, they asked David if he had any pictures of Ronald in case they needed them. And he's like, "Well, what do you know? I'll send you a few." The following day, they got an email from David with a photograph of Ron and another guy in it. David had kind of ringed Ron and written his name next to him. And using that image, they were able to verify that Ron had a matching tattoo on the back of his hand to the one that was found on the body. David also attested to the fact that the tattoo featured the Canadian maple leaf. In the eyes of the police, that effectively puts an end to it. After a few months, they're prepared to declare it an accident and wrap up the investigation. But before they can truly close it, there are just a few formalities that need to be completed. They attempt to contact David Davis once more, but he is not returning their calls. Thus, they make the decision to send a policeman to his residence in order to establish communication with him. Furthermore, the policeman they dispatched to that location had never before visited his residence, and it appeared as though there were just 4 houses without numbers on the street. They went by names like Little London House and Little London Farmhouse, etc., and there were only 4 residences, and this cop had no idea which one was David's. He simply made the decision to knock. When he knocked on the door of the first house on the street, Frank and Audrey, an old couple, answered, and the cop said, "Hey, is this, Little London Farmhouse?" They reply, "No, this is a small London home. There are small London farmhouses next door. Who are you trying to find?" And he clarifies, "Well, I'm just trying to find David Davis." They say, "Oh, you won't find him next door because Ronald Platt is next door." As it happens, David Davis had been residing in this mansion under the false impression of being his deceased buddy Ronald Platt. Police said, "Well, that's pretty bizarre. Perhaps there's a more dubious motive at work here." Furthermore, this man's death was not an accident, and this is just another one of those tiny coincidences. For example, if the fishermen hadn't gone out to the rocks, they wouldn't have been able to see clearly and find the exact location of his body. Additionally, if he hadn't been wearing his Rolex, they would never have been able to identify his body. Had David Davis returned his call, they would never have entered his home had they not dispatched an officer who had never been there. He would not have gone to the incorrect address, engaged in this chat with these individuals, and discovered that he is adopting the identity of his deceased friend. In any case, the officer continued his conversation with Frank and Audrey, the elderly couple, to find out additional information about David Davis. Furthermore, it is stated that David and his significantly younger wife moved in a short while ago. Additionally, they now had a toddler and an infant as children. In addition, he owned a boat that he used to sell on a regular basis but didn't know the name of. He even records a description of the boat. There was really nothing more they could do to learn more about this boat or its location. They made the decision to go speak with the fishermen again to see if they could provide any additional information. Additionally, they said that an anchor was raised along with Ronald's body when it was raised. However, they had donated this anchor to a buddy, who then gave it to his mother so that it could be sold as a marker or something. Happily, the mother had not succeeded in selling it at the market. As a result, the police were unaware that the anchor could be recovered at the moment. However, this anchor would prove to be a significant piece of evidence in this case and would carry a great deal of weight. The police continue to investigate David Davis and his activities since it is obvious that something fishy is going on. They speak with Ronald's brother, who informs them that Ronald had a long-term relationship with Elaine Boyes. 3 years prior to Ronald's death, in 1993, after a 10-year relationship they parted ways. They proceeded to converse with her. When she learned that Dad had died, she was stunned, as she briefly described him to them. She described him as a friendly, kind, and attractive man. She also mentioned his Rolex, describing it as his most valuable property. Even when taking a shower, he wore it all the time. She also briefly updated them on David Davis. Elaine had been working as a receptionist at an auction business in Harrogate when David entered, which is how she and Ronald first met him in 1991. After spending approximately an hour and a half at the auction house chatting with Elaine, she claimed he was very tall, personable, and interesting. He resembled the ideal man in certain ways. She told him, "You know, I won't be able to work for you for very long because me and my partner are planning to move over to Canada after he finally made her an offer of employment. Don't worry, I'll help you save up for that because I'll pay you more than you would here," he said. And she said, "Well, that's amazing." Following her introduction of David to Ronald, the three of them developed a strong friendship. David and Ronald clicked immediately away, becoming fast friends. And not too long afterward, David established the Cavendish Corporation, asking Elaine and Ronald to serve as the company's directors as he didn't want to be on the board himself. He had an estranged ex-wife who was pursuing him for maintenance or something, so he didn't want his name associated with it. Furthermore, he didn't want her to be able to come attempt and get a portion of the money that the business had given him. And Ronald and Elaine said, "Well, that makes sense, come on, let's do it." And they were appointed directors of the business. Elaine was employed by the corporation as a property view and travel agent for Europe, although the company never bought any of the homes she visited. She would also put money into David's overseas bank accounts while she was gone. David, she added, was a deeply devout man. He became active in the Harrogate Baptist Church in his community. He exuded a strong religious aura and frequently discussed God and his beliefs. She said, "You know, you believe in and trust someone who practices religion, though I'm not sure whether I would necessarily agree with that. I don't think that's the best reason to trust someone." In any case, David invited Ronald and Elaine to spend Christmas Day 1992 with him and his daughter Noelle. They reported that Noelle and David had a peculiar relationship, with Noelle always seeking her father's permission to speak or do something else whenever they tried to speak to her directly or give her an Oscar. I'm not sure. However, David ultimately purchased 2 tickets for Ronald and Elaine to travel to Canada for that Christmas. The tickets were set to expire in 2 months, so they had to depart by February 1993. Elaine thought, damn, that was a bit quick. She was thinking, wow, this is such a huge thing to do within the next 2 months, even though Ronald was clearly very excited. From 0012:49:01 to 0012:23:13. David then said, you know what, you two have been discussing it. If you don't take the risk, you won't succeed in your endeavor. They then said, okay, let's get started, come with me to Canada. In order for Ronald to sign things like company documents and the like while they were away, David asked that he leave behind his driver's license and certificate, as well as have their signatures rubber stamped. David also asked them to continue serving as directors of the firm while they were in Canada. Not sure. And he said, it's pretty regular practice, I've done it before. And they said something like, well, that makes sense. And then Ronald and Elaine relocated to Canada in February 1993. Regretfully, though, things weren't going well at all, and they were having financial difficulties after moving to Canada. Elaine experienced joblessness. They weren't truly settling because it was the midst of winter, and Ronald first had trouble finding employment. Elaine had to return to England 5 months after the transfer in order to be a bridesmaid in her sister's wedding, and by then she and Ronald had broken up. She then made the decision to simply remain in England following the wedding. Since David Davis was close friends with both Ronald and Roy, he was there at their wedding as well. And they struck up a conversation as soon as he and Elaine saw one another during the ceremony. Elaine informed him that she and Ronald had broken up. In reality, I intend to remain in England, and David exclaimed, oh my God, what's happening? You must return. You need to offer him another chance. You must return to Canada. And she said, dude, this is not happening. Following the hop, David Davis disappeared for approximately 3 days, and he didn't communicate with Elaine for the following 3 years. She also didn't really communicate with Ronald because, well, they were no longer together, but she was aware that he had returned to England in the end. She was unaware, though, that David Davis had been pretending to be Ronald Platt, her ex-boyfriend, which is why he disappeared. In order to continue mimicking him without being discovered, he moved elsewhere. And for the following 3 years, he carried on living as Ronald. 3 months after Ronald's body was found, David and Elaine did eventually speak again, around a week before Elaine spoke to the police. This implies that by the time they spoke, David was aware that Ronald's body had been found, but he had not informed Elaine. In fact, Elaine asked him, have you heard from Ronald during that phone call? No, as far as I know, he moved to France in June, and I haven't heard from him since, he said. She didn't realize David had been lying to her until she met with the police a week later. As a result, David also gave Elaine a call after a short while. She was kind of debating whether or not to bring up the whole Ronald incident when she finally decided to just ask David, over the phone, oh, have you heard about Ronald? His history. And he seemed to shift completely in attitude right away. He asked, can we meet up in person, as she became very serious and quiet. She's obviously too afraid to do this, as evidenced by the fact that she recently spoke with the cops. She recently learned that he had misled her about his knowledge of Ronald's passing. She accepts to meet up with him, even though she knows he has been pretending to be Ronald for whatever long, all in an effort to avoid coming across as suspicious or anything. They discussed Ronald. I cried the entire train journey here, he added. I've been really depressed. Every night I've been praying for him. She also mentioned that everything looked to be a performance. Despite how phony and superficial it was, she went along with it until he departed. She then phoned the police after he had left. Furthermore, the authorities now possessed sufficient proof to detain him for the murder of Ronald. She then informed them that he had left. To meet me, he said he had phoned the train. Thus, they presumed he would take the train to return home. Additionally, he would need to disembark at Chelmsford Station if he intended to catch the train. In order to arrest him when he came, the police went to Chelmsford Station to wait for him. However, he didn't return home that evening. Thus, while he waits for reinforcements, an officer goes to his house the following day to kind of check through the windows and make sure someone is indeed home. Because, as I previously indicated, they're presuming that, given his accent, he might be American. They therefore believe that he might be armed, and they clearly intend to take him into custody for murder. Thus, he poses a threat and might be armed. They thus made the decision that they would like to use armed officers to make the arrest. As he waits for the armed officers and reinforcements to show up, David gets into a cab that unexpectedly pulls up in front of his house. They then leave. As a result, the officer who was bailing and masturbating is clearly following them and signaling to the reinforcement, saying, "Hey, this is the location right now." Then, out of nowhere, every single armed officer begins to rapidly approach from behind them. The taxi's sirens sound, and they suddenly dart in front of it, stopping it from moving forward, because he did an interview and stated, "I thought he was just a regular guy." I can't even begin to comprehend what is going through this cab driver's mind. We were exchanging courteous words. He was a man of great kindness. Then, as if to halt him, all of these military forces suddenly approach them and whip in front of the car. Their rifles drawn, they approach the taxi. What the hell is going on? That would have been his only thought. My passenger, who is she? He was talking fairly pleasantly while seated next to me in the front seat. It appeared to be an ordinary business conversation. Nice, cordial conversation. I turned around and asked the man next to me, I wasn't doing anything wrong, were I? When I saw in the mirror that a police car was approaching me from behind at a high speed with flashing lights. So they draw their pistols and approach the taxi. David is forced to get out of the car, return to the boot, and place his hands there. They find him, inform him that he is being held for the murder of Ronald Platt, and bring him to the Chelmsford police station to be questioned. Additionally, he has been very cooperative throughout the entire arrest procedure. Afterwards, when they searched him once more at the police station, they discovered Ronald Platt's ID in one pocket and David Davies' ID in another. Thus, even though they now have unquestionable evidence that he is impersonating Ronald Platt, it is insufficient to both convict him of the murder and make an arrest. I apologize, but the evidence against him is insufficient to convict him. Therefore, more proof is required. When they go to David's residence to arrest him, his wife is astonished beyond belief that David has been taken into custody. She is not at least fazed. However, she tells them, "Hey, could you just let me pack an overnight bag for the kids since it is evident that they have a toddler and a newborn?" Naturally, the police respond with, "Yeah, no worries." She is then accompanied by a female officer while she packs the luggage. And the weight of the luggage is felt by this female officer. "What the hell have you got in here?" she asks. When she opens the overnight bag, she discovers that David's wife has filled it to the brim with cash and gold bars. Just what a young child and a toddler require. Yes, however, they bring her to the station so that David can question her, and they both remain composed the entire time. David is also quite honest. Being very cooperative, he keeps telling them that he hasn't done anything and that he truly wants to assist them establish that this was just an unfortunate accident or that he can help you identify the perpetrator. However, David's behavior totally changes when the police activate a recording to capture the exchange. He shuts down entirely and declines to respond to any more queries. He provides them with zero proof. Therefore, the police will need to collect their own evidence and establish a link between David and Ronald Platt's murder. Upon searching David and his wife's home on October 31st, 1996, the police car discovered PS 25,000 in cash, 8,000 Swiss francs, 17 gold bars, and artworks with a combined worth of PS 6,000. Additionally, they removed everything from the residence. They had very much emptied it. They stole everything, including records, jewelry, artwork, and pictures. And as they were going through everything they had stolen from the house, they came upon a picture of David aboard the Lady Jane, a yacht. But even with the boat's name, they were still unsure of its whereabouts. They had no idea where it was tied up or anything. One day, the inspector overseeing the search teams arrives at the station for a briefing and notices the name of the yacht, Lady Jane, written there, as if it were proof, on a whiteboard. "Oh, I know that boat," he replies. "I have witnessed both dry docking and docking on the mainland." The police then proceed to the mainland, where they discover the boat. They return it to the lab for forensic analysis. Additionally, they discover remnants of Ronald Platt's blood and hair in the boat's stateroom. In the cabin, they also discover a bag from a store named Sporting or Teak. Furthermore, Ron's fingerprints were on this bag. Additionally, they discovered a receipt for an anchor they bought from Sport and Antiques. Thus, each time I say that, they descend to spawn or take a shot. However, when they descend and speak with the employees, they learn that although two men did come in and buy an anchor, it wasn't the right one for the Lady Jane. Additionally, the Lady Jane was already equipped with an anchor, and the anchor that was carried up with Ronald's body was the one that was bought from Sporting, not Hague. Thus, in case you forgot, the fisherman offered a friend the same anchor. The buddy presented it to his mom. The mother was able to be recovered from by the police, and that would subsequently turn into a significant piece of evidence, I said. After examining this anchor, the pathologist discovered that it precisely matched the wounds discovered on Ronald's legs and back. Additionally, the leather belt that Ronald was wearing when his body was discovered contained zinc. Additionally, the finish on this anchor and this zinc matched flawlessly. They came to the conclusion that David had knocked Ronald out with this anchor. After that, he fastened it to Ronald's belt and hurled him overboard, letting the anchor drag him to the ocean below. They thought this David Davis person was American, so even with all of this proof, sir, it wasn't enough for a conviction. After sending his fingerprints to Interpol, they received a response from them in a matter of hours stating that this individual was not David Davis. This man's name is Albert Johnson Walker, in fact. He is a Canadian wanted man, because to his $1993.2 million fraud against over 70 Canadian clients, he is listed as one of Interpol's most wanted individuals. After that, he and his daughter Sheena fled to Europe. So, as they discovered this, all of his lies began to come apart. They discovered that he and his wife had separated and had 3 children together back in Canada. He then announces to his family as a whole, "Hey, I'm going to take my daughter Sheena skiing." However, he never returned from the skiing excursion. Sheena was just 15 years old, therefore the rest of the Walker family was somewhat worried, so they posted flyers for missing persons. Despite reporting her missing, they were unable to locate them. They were clueless about Albert's whereabouts. They were clueless as to where he had taken Sheena, and that's of course since he had run away to Europe from Canada, where he had taken on the alias David Davis. In reality, the real David Davis was an investor he had defrauded of money in his large-scale financial scheme back in Canada. Allow me to walk you through the events that transpired after that. Thus, he traveled to England with his daughter from Canada and took on the name David Davis. After that, in 1991, he relocated to Harrogate, where he made friends with Ronald Platt and his partner Elaine Boyce. He paid for their relocation to Canada and appointed them directors of his company within 18 months of first meeting them. And then he took over Ronald Platt's identity after they relocated to Canada. Thus, he was understandably shocked when Elaine returned 5 months later and announced that she would be staying in England. He relocated to Devon, which is 500 kilometers or 300 miles distant, since he could not possibly be in Elaine's vicinity at all, lest she discover that he is posing as Ronald. So he and his extremely young, extremely pregnant wife move into the small London farmhouse in Devon. And throughout his time there, he paints a little bit. He even signs his name and the name David on these paintings. At one point, he realizes this and asks, "Who is David?" "Oh, that's just what they used to call me back in college," she replies. She doesn't really give it any more thought. Then, in September 1993, his wife gives birth to her first child. In case you didn't guess it, his wife is actually his daughter Sheena, whom he abducted and brought to England. Furthermore, her children's paternity has never been established to this day. Thus, we are genuinely unsure of his paternity. However, many in their immediate vicinity reported that, due to their convincing behavior and marriage-like demeanor, they never once questioned or doubted that they were husband and wife, so they relocated once more in 1994. After relocating from Devon to Essex, they lived there for 2 years. And then in 1995, Ronald Platt, also known as Sir David Davis, Albert Walker, or whatever you want to name him, moved back to Essex, particularly returning to England. By now, he was clearly posing as Ronald, therefore he was upset that Ronald had relocated to Essex since he knew that people would start to question him, if that is accurate. Ronald Platt, who shares the same birthday, identification, and residence in the same neighborhood, has managed to elude detection and avoid prosecution for an extended period of time. He didn't want Ronald Platt to ruin things for him after he managed to escape to England after tricking everyone back in Canada and rob him of his liberty. Hence, he had to murder him. So he invites the actual Ronald Platt to come out to his bar and engage in a little friendly fishing, and he asked him to go fishing with the express purpose of killing Ronald. Ronald, however, was unaware that you were out fishing with your friend and that you weren't considering the possibility that he would make a friend out of me. He doesn't think twice about it because they've been excellent friends for a very long time. "Okay, let's go fishing," he says. And that's where Ronald was killed and thrown overboard by Albert Walker, also known as David Davis. After that, his body was discovered 2 weeks later. The rest of the story is known to you. Albert Walker entered a not guilty plea when his trial for the murder of Ronald Platt started in June 1998. Throughout his trial, he showed no emotion or regret, and he even gave off the impression that he was certain he wouldn't be found guilty because, at this point, the prosecution was unable to provide a date of his marriage to Ronald, which is crucial in a murder case. However, Ron's Rolex provided a huge assistance with that. As a result, they were able to calculate that the Rolex would cease to function approximately 38 hours after being submerged in water. As a result, they were able to prove that he was killed on July 20th or 21, since his watch had stopped on July 22nd. Additionally, the position of Ron's body at that moment was indicated by the global positioning system of the boat to be Albert or David Davis, BART. After deliberating for 2 hours at the conclusion of the trial, the jury found Albert Walker guilty of Ronald Platt's murder. On February 22nd, the jury sentenced Walker to life in prison. He was given permission to move back to Ontario, Canada, in 2005 in order to be nearer to his family. His daughter Sheena even mentioned this. The first time she had publicly come out against her father since the trial was in 2005, when she was 29 years old, opposing this. She referred to him as evil. He was a con man, she said. She said that he had coerced her into posing as his wife to strangers and that he had deceived and misled her just as much as he did every other person. She added that instead of allowing him to go back to Canada, she would have preferred if he had stayed and died in an English prison. She said that she still fears him, that she feels he poses a threat to her and her family, and that she must keep her kids and family safe from him. She worries about her safety and the safety of her family now that he is in Canada, because Albert may face more charges for theft, fraud, and money laundering once he is eventually freed. Additionally, he was given a 4-year sentence for fraud and a 1-year sentence for violating the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act on July 23, 2007. He requested parole in 2021 but was turned down. Furthermore, he has never expressed regret for his deeds up until this point. He is still incarcerated in British Columbia at the age of 75. However, that's all. That's all there is to it. That concludes my day. I'm really interested in hearing what you guys think about this. Since I was genuinely captivated by this situation, I've been particularly interested to hear your opinions. The way all these coincidences kept happening and this case started to slowly come together was just so fascinating to me. The situation continued to spiral out of control. And similar to how everything happened by coincidence, they never would have raised his body if they hadn't been fishing at that very location and sent their weighted net all the way down to the ocean below. Had he not been wearing his Rolex, they would never have been able to identify him in the event that he had returned an officer's call. They would never have sent an officer to his house who had never been there before. And he would never have ended up at the wrong house and discovered he was impersonating Ronald. And they never would have given his fingerprints to Interpol if they hadn't assumed he was American. And Interpol would never have been able to say, actually, that guy's on our most wanted list because he's a massive con artist that scammed 70 people out of $3.2 million.